Well, our brand new X15 CM2450 that was in the boom truck was not acting correctly. We thought it was broken. In fact, there was nothing wrong with the engine at all. The problem was the duty cycle. Now, do you remember that I told you that the engine would idle up under about 750 and then the operator all day long would take it up to 1400? Well, the X15 is one of the best engines that Cummins has to deal with light duty cycles. So if you looked a number of videos back, I talked about what RPM to idle your engines at in the winter. And I said the mid-range about 1050 to 1100. And I said the ISX 15 and now the X15, keep it at 950. Here's the reason why. There's a software routine built into the engine, and of course it looks at the ambient temperature because it knows what it is, because there's an ambient temperature sensor on the unit. In this case, it was in the right side passenger mirror, and so the engine knows what the ambient temperature is, and then it knows what the coolant temperature is, oil temperature, it knows the after treatment temperatures. So the software routine, when it runs, as long as the RPM's under 950, it will put the engine into an after treatment warming mode. Remember, this engine doses fuel on the exhaust stroke. It can dose fuel, and it can raise the temperature of that after treatment up to 400, 500, or 600 degrees just sitting and idling. And that is sufficient when it gets up over little over 600 degrees to burn any soot that's being accumulated. Now, why do they do this? Well, when an engine goes into a passive regen going down a freeway, it looks at mile per hour and it looks at exhaust flow, and that flow translates into restriction across the diesel particulate filter pressure sensor. They call it the delta P sensor. In this case, this exhaust flow is very low. That's why we took a look at the cubic feet per minute, and we looked at the mass flow as well. And when the exhaust flow is very low, the ECM software doesn't trust the differential pressure sensor. So what it does is it reverts to that timer I talked about in the past, where the unit will regen every 100 to 130 hours once it hits that timer. And it'll just live off of that timer over and over and over. Now, the operator would take the RPM up to about 1400. So as soon as we get over 950, that shuts down that after treatment heating process because we're out of that mode. Now at 1400 RPM, even with a little load, we've got a lot of flow in the exhaust system. And guess what happens? All that heat goes away because we're not making much heat coming out of the engine. We're just making a lot of flow compared to pulling up a hill, pulling a load where you're injecting a lot of fuel into the cylinder. Remember, more fuel and load, the boost goes up. Well, we had a lower boost in the teens and maybe the mid-20s at best, where this engine's probably up 65 or 70 on a hard pull, inches of mercury I'm talking about, in the intake manifold. And then we've got a lot of fuel going in, so that translates to a lot of heat in the exhaust to burn soot. In our case, this had been sitting on outriggers for 6 weeks. That was a key. If you were listening, I said that twice in the past for a reason. It sat for 5 or 6 weeks. And so this never had much exhaust flow. So it went into warm-up mode and it went out of it, and in it and out of it. And what happened? We never got enough heat to do anything. We never had enough flow to get a really good reading. But as the restriction went up and up and up, the operator did a lift. He pulled on a lever. It was a heavier lift. He throttled it up. And I don't have a snapshot of that, but that's what happened. The exhaust flow got high enough that the ECM trusted the differential pressure sensor, and it saw that the soot load was up there. Now, in the snapshot, we noticed that soot load was very low. That's because it wasn't able to catch the number that it read quickly enough, and the load went, as soon as the load took off and started moving, the requirements on the engine went down. So the flow went down, and then the engine would revert back to running on the timer when it came to regens. So because this was happening, the filter got a little bit more loaded and a little bit more loaded and a little bit more loaded. And then we had a quick exhaust flow. It shot up, it logged 1921, and that's why our guy got called out there. And then he saw the 2639, which, if you noticed in the snapshot, does not drive a check engine light. So until that 1921 logged, there was no check engine light. Now, what was the fix? How do we stop this? Well, you can't stop it. The engine's in a precarious situation. It's stuck in light load. It's not permitted to run below 950 long enough to go into the cleaning mode, where it passively heats the exhaust system. And then when it does have to work, it's not working near hard enough to get the after treatment even close to warm enough to burn the soot. So in this case, we have what's called a Band-Aid. And the Band-Aid would be, as long as that machine's out there, every 7 days, not every day, every 7 days, our guy goes out and puts it in a stationary regeneration with Insight and lets it do a complete good clean out and burn. And then it's okay until the next week when he goes out. Now, let's back up. How come this truck ran so long with no problems? Remember what I said earlier? I said these trucks come back every day or at least once a week normally. Well, most of these things go out. When they leave the yard where they are, they climb up about a half a mile hill that's pretty steep. By the time they get to the top of that hill, they're pretty warm. And then they get on the freeway. And they might be on the freeway anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 or 3 hours. So on the trip out and the trip back, they get a good cleaning because they get up over 45 miles an hour and the engine's able to get hot and the after treatment's hot and it cleans itself out. So in recap, we had all these problems with after treatment. There was no problem. It was duty cycle. If you want to blame it on something, it was an extremely light duty cycle. Number one. Number two, the engine never got worked like it normally does, driving to and from the job, either daily or once a week or every other week. Number three, the routine that was built in the software, it's actually a subroutine to clean the after treatment, wasn't allowed to work properly because the operator was constantly going above 950 RPM with his foot throttle to do picks and lifts. So it was what it was. So that's the story. And now you understand a little bit about the X15 and the subroutine for cleaning the after treatment and why you keep it under 950 if you idle all night and you have that engine and you're sleeping in your truck or whatever. That's why you have to do that. So we did the regen, the fault went away, and the world is good again, and nothing was wrong. I did ask Cummins if there was a different calibration that we could put in to stop this problem, and they said no. And they said we do experience this in one other arena, and I guess there are some trucks that run I'm not sure if they're at oil fields or where. They run up and they idle, and then they hook up a small hydraulic pump and they pump out a tank into another tank, and then they just run up the road a little bit and do the same thing all day long. And those experience the same problem. And the way they got around that was they put a small engine on the back of the truck that runs the hydraulic pump, and they don't use the drive engine to sit for hours and run it. So it's just the nature of the beast. We don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes you can't make equipment behave perfectly. But you can figure out what's wrong and make it work. And that's what we did in this case. Thanks for joining me on Engine Shop Joe, and please subscribe. See you next time.